This episode is supported by NatWest, providing ease of mind when it comes to business payments.
NatWest Pay It, the bank's own payment solution, facilitates customer payments in near real time while allowing companies to track live spending. Need to collect payments without customer account numbers or process refunds without holding on to personal details? Pay It has your business covered.
Pay It connects directly with each customer's bank account using an API, which also allows data to be seamlessly and securely passed onto third parties. That means you can provide the best payment experience on the front end while empowering your back-end staff with the info they need for truly data-driven decision-making.
To find out more, visit payitbynatwest.com/ITPro. That's payitbynatwest.com/ITPro. It's All Hallows Day and we've still got Halloween on the brain. It's that time of the year when we tell the scariest stories we can, and for those in tech, there are none scarier than the majority of cybersecurity incidents.
So, if you'll forgive us the indulgence, and for not releasing this on Halloween itself, we thought it would be a good opportunity for us to pore over some of the notably spooky tales from the world of IT.
But what have the biggest cybersecurity horror stories of the year been so far? And what can businesses learn from these grisly incidents? You're listening to the ITPro podcast. Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Rory Bathgate.
Today we're speaking to Solomon Klappholz, staff writer at ITPro and our resident cybersecurity expert, to take us on a tour of the year's most serious cybersecurity failures. Solomon, welcome to the show.
Hi guys, good to be here. Excited to talk all spooky cyber stories with you.
To kick us off, why don't you tell us about one of the standout cyber incidents of the year that I'm sure everybody will be familiar with, CrowdStrike's outage in July?
Yeah, so like you said, Jane, probably the biggest story of the year. And interestingly, I think it's best described as a cyber incident because there wasn't actually any malicious attack involved. But I guess that just reminds us that, cybersecurity is a human exercise and human error remains the bogeyman of cyber resilience and IT admins all over the world.
Yeah, so can you give us a bit of a download on what actually happened?
Sure thing. So back in July, a logic flaw to an update to CrowdStrike's antivirus program, Falcon Sensor, was sent out and essentially bricked millions of devices all over the world. We saw public screens showing the blue screen of death. We saw flights cancelled. People couldn't log on to their work devices. Students couldn't sign into their university portals. Probably one of the most significant cases of disruption caused by a cyber outage of the year.
I think the way that I heard it described was, this is what the Millennium Bug would have been like had people not worked to prevent it from, or to fix it rather. So the impact was massive. I mean, yeah, I remember going down to Co-op down the road and everybody was having to pay in cash. I didn't have any cash because I live in, I live in England and it's 2024. So I had to double back. But I heard the guy at the cash desk say, yeah, it's cash only. No, the self-pay machines don't work. You've probably seen about it on the news. It's a Windows problem, and I think that kind of highlights two things. One is that's got to be the first time that anything that I really have to do with work has been so widespread that the guy in COGS going, "You've all already heard about it on the news," and B, that it was being attributed to a problem with Microsoft or Windows, because while it wasn't a problem with anything to do with Microsoft software, that's where the impact was felt.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it sort of raised an issue that around the level of access these antivirus software has within the Windows architecture. So the reason this logic flaw led to so many devices being totally unusable is because antivirus software like CrowdStrike's Falcon and Sentinel-1, for example, they need root level access, essentially the highest level of privilege, to be able to stop a cyber attack as it's happening in real time. And so because they have these high level of privileges linked into the Windows kernel. When something went wrong, it left, I think, around 8.5 million devices were affected by the update, with IT admins all over the world facing the blue screen of death, something of sort of the harbinger of doom for any IT worker. And that number is probably higher. That's just based on the number of users who shared their crash reports. And so we're probably talking about a good degree of more devices were affected than we actually know about. Insurers, I think, estimated that it will cost Fortune 500 companies around $5.4 billion. And at the time, we had experts everywhere saying this will lead to major legal fallout, class action lawsuits. And yeah, we've already seen a few companies start to take legal action against CrowdStrike for the damages.
Yeah, I was going to say there seems to be something fairly hair-raising for CrowdStrike's bank balance. Delta is suing the company for, is it 500 mil in damages?
Yes, very concerning for CrowdStrike and the CEO. At the time of the outage or shortly afterwards, Delta CEO came out with some sort of fighting words around that, declaring that they would be seeking damages from the outage, essentially saying it was CrowdStrike's negligence that led to the issue. And at the time, we saw CrowdStrike's lawyer, Michael Kolinsky, sort of come out, put a statement out, trying to sort of flip blame back onto Delta, I suppose, saying that CrowdStrike, the difference between CrowdStrike and Delta in this incident was that CrowdStrike immediately took responsibility for the disruption, whereas I think he's suggesting Delta's recovery strategy maybe exacerbated the level of disruption they faced, sort of citing the fact that other airlines were able to recover faster. But yeah, as you say, this is an ongoing story in Delta. I think, Rory, we've got more recent news about this case today.
Yeah, so as Jane said, there's an ongoing lawsuit with Delta suing CrowdStrike. It's saying it's seeking $500 million in damages, and that there were $380 million in losses, followed by $170 million in recovery costs. I mean, linking into that kind of that 5 billion number you said earlier, and what you said earlier, Jane, around the kind of vibes of Y2K that this whole thing gave, the sheer scale of the thing, and also how it cut across every single sector and every single facet of life. It's it goes without saying that it was just awful, really, for CrowdStrike. But yeah, I mean, the day of the actual outage and the days following, you had reports from people like, for example, Zoe Kleinman. The BBC was doing really good work covering it on the national news. But that's the point: is it made it outside of the B2B space and into the consumer space. I had friends messaging me, or my parents were asking about it.
Yeah.
And I was saying, I know who this company is. It's the kind of company that we'll deal with in our side of things. But then people were feeling this, and as you said, Jane, people were initially misattributing it to Microsoft. They were saying that it was a Windows issue, which obviously has implications for Microsoft itself, because you have to, at the same time as saying, well, no, it's not really us, you can't immediately come out of the gates and say, oh, it's all CrowdStrike's problem. You have to be diplomatic about it, while also, as clearly as you can, saying, please don't blame us. Don't associate blue screens of. I think the blue screen of death as well is as a kind of iconography. Obviously, that is a Windows thing that happens on Windows machines. It's just what will happen if a Windows machine is bricked. But it's so notable and it sticks in your head so much that people were also calling it kind of like the worldwide BSOD or the worldwide blue screen issue, rather than, as you say, Sol, what it was, which is really kind of a root kernel problem.
I wonder, do you think most people who are not inside the bubble that we and our audience are, the IT professional sphere, realize that it was not a Microsoft issue now? Like, do you think that messaging cut through, or do you think that people are still going to reflect on this as the Windows outage of summer 2024?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say for the average person, the fact that you would see that Windows devices were affected and not macOS devices or Linux devices, that kind of will go a long way in making people's minds up around where the issue relay. I think Microsoft definitely tried their hardest to be clear about this in the following months. And the CrowdStrike CEO has been on something of a press tour to sort of owning up to the mistakes that led up to the issue. But yeah, it definitely put Microsoft in a difficult position diplomatically, and they had to navigate it less belligerently than, let's say, Delta did.
Yeah, it was not hard at all. And I think also you're kind of in that vein. CrowdStrike did work very hard to get it fixed. That it's fixed now. It took couple of days to get it all completely sorted. To have the problem identified, roll it back, and all of that. So it's not like people were left languishing. The impact was big. Let's not minimize that. It was massive. It was felt basically everywhere. But at the same time, they did at least act quickly to address the problem and get customers back up on their feet.
Yeah, I think we're going to be talking about another case later on in this episode where a company didn't act so quickly, or at least so transparently. And I think that is maybe a good reflection on CrowdStrike in a sort of sea of bad press. This is the sort of one shining light they can maybe hold on to, is that they were honest about what had happened, or at least I think the consensus is that Delta may be contending they weren't so honest. But yeah, ultimately, I think CrowdStrike were fairly diligent in accepting responsibility for the issue and acting on it as quickly as they could. I mean, it was difficult because the update was deployed remotely, and it was difficult to remove for a lot of number of enterprises, including Delta, saying that was one of the reasons why they weren't able to recover from the incident, was because they hadn't authorized it automatically and applied, and they weren't able to remove it from the machines without physically getting hands on keyboards.
So we've talked a bit there about CrowdStrike and its link to Windows, but of course Linux hasn't escaped the year unscathed either, has it? We saw with the XZ utils backdoor a pretty severe backdoor for threat actors where they could compromise systems remotely. So talk us through that a bit, Sol.
Yeah, well, this case is a sort of particularly spooky one in terms of the lengths hackers are willing to go through to get access to widely used tools, utilities, because that's kind of the name of the game. Get access to as many people's devices as possible to cause the most disruption. So XZUtils is an open source project used on many, I'd say virtually all Linux systems out of the box, used for lossless compression. And it's almost like a default now that programmers will add to their projects immediately just because it's so useful. And the whole incident arose, as you said, due to a backdoor in the project that was added that allowed for a remote code execution on, well, tens of millions of machines around the world. So yeah, the story began when the original maintainer of XZUtils, Last Colin, was sort of pressured to add a new developer to maintain the project, as they were falling behind on updates and they weren't maintaining the project perhaps as some users maybe wanted. We saw an individual by the name of Jian Tan, or username GiaT75, had begun submitting patches to the project for over 2 years, and eventually was added to as an official maintainer of the project in January 2024. And over time, they became sort of increasingly central to the whole XZUtils operation. We saw evidence of Jiantan replacing Colin's contact information with their own on OSS Fuzz, which is an open source vulnerability scanning service. So that meant Tan could request that OSS Fuzz disable certain functions for testing, specifically one function that would have actually prevented them from detecting the changes Tan were making to the project, which proved malicious. And so in February this year, Tan issued commits for 2 of the newer versions of XZUtils, and these updates actually injected the backdoor onto the systems. In the following weeks, Tan appealed to the developers of Ubuntu, Red Hat, Debian to actually merge this update on their OS, sort of baking it into these incredibly popular Linux distributions that are used on millions of devices all over the world. And it could have proved incredibly costly if it wasn't for the keen eye of a Microsoft engineer who was just sort of surveying some code and noticed the back door and brought it to everyone's attention.
So, and I'm going to make a horror movie comparison here, or a kind of a film comparison, because I felt like Halloween episode. I have to. If the previous example of CrowdStrike was something like an alien invasion film with major widespread impact across the world, you could say that this was more of a invasion of the body snatchers thing, or the thing, where or even Scream with the call coming from inside the house. This is an insider threat of someone making these malicious changes unseen that very nearly caused kind of major attacks across some of the different vendors that you named.
Yeah, exactly. You could see exactly what the threat actor was, what their game plan was. And I think that's probably the most interesting part of this case, was the process of winning the trust of the original maintainer of xedutils and really playing that game of sort of, I think usually social engineering is quite a rushed process where you try and get someone to click on a link or scan a QR code quickly without sort of engaging the critical faculties. Whereas this was a case where they played the long game, and it had a lot of subterfuge and sort of espionage elements, which I'm sure was very scary for Last Colin, who had realized they'd been duped over the course of years.
I guess you could say that there's another cautionary tale here, where, again, making comparison to the CrowdStrike outage, that that has made a lot of companies reassess their dependency maybe on one vendor. If you have all these people across all these critical industries using one vendor, even with the best of intentions and even without an attacker, you could have a major kind of choke point or a major outage like we saw. And in this case, the importance of keeping your eye on your open source kind of supply chain, the security of the individual tools that you're using, that might be being kept up by just one person. Like you've said, you can't have one person necessarily complete all the work that is necessary. And then if they're bringing in outside help, who is that? Can they be trusted? And what are their motivations, particularly in an ecosystem that relies so much on developer goodwill, people willing to update these critical tools for nothing?
Definitely. I think as cyber complexity is really growing, increasing alarming rate, third-party risk and the software supply chain is being raised as a core concern for many enterprises. And we've seen governments are getting involved now, requiring or adding obligations to try and bolster supply chain security from a regulatory perspective.
It's a really interesting one for me, this, because it kind of proves and disproves the idea that open source is secure because there are many eyes on it. Because on the one hand, like, it went unnoticed for a really long time what was happening here, but it was one of the many eyes that were on it just checking through it that realized what was going on. So I mean, it came very close to being, really, really serious, really serious. If that Microsoft dev hadn't noticed that there was something weird going on, then we could be talking about a very different scenario if they hadn't.
Yeah, exactly. I think that sort of speaks to the ghost story element of this case, where things could have gone a lot worse if it wasn't for, and I'll name him Andres Freund, who reported the backdoor, because I think he deserves a lot of credit.
So to finish with, we have something of a Halloween double feature, which is a breach followed by how not to deal with having had a breach.
Exactly. I think you could describe this case as a good example of how a business shouldn't respond to being breached. In an era where breaches are sort of being treated as inevitable, so it's increasingly important that business leaders get on top of their recovery strategy, and a big part of that is your PR strategy around how you acknowledge and then move forward after you've suffered a breach and the reputational damage associated with that. And so the protagonist of this ghost story is 23andMe.
They are surely the antagonist in this.
Okay, yeah, that's perhaps a good point of view. So in 2023, the DNA ancestry service 23andMe suffered a data breach, which saw 6.9 million customers have their personal information exposed. Any individual who had used the DNA relatives feature may have had their name, year of birth, and ancestry information exposed during the breach. 23andMe said the unauthorized access took place between April and September of 2023, but didn't confirm the overall impact of the breach until December that year. And when it did acknowledge the incident, it was interesting because it seemed to be on the offensive immediately, sort of engaging in damage control, looking to get on the front foot and deflect the blame away from itself. The company had sent a letter to victims in January claiming that customers that is, had neglected to refresh their passwords after security incidents unrelated to 23andMe. And because they'd reused these passwords, criminal actors were able to access their database. And they sort of used that to say the incident wasn't the result of any security failings at the company, sort of painting 23andMe as a innocent sort of bystander in an unrelated security event.
This is 100% the character who, upon hearing like the noises of monsters or clanging chains or whatever in the basement, goes to look down there themselves while declaring that there isn't actually a problem. This is a massive self-inflicted wound that could have been entirely avoided.
Yeah, exactly. We spoke to Yvonne Eskenzi, co-founder of cybersecurity PR firm Eskenzi PR, in January, after this letter was sent to victims, and she labelled it a blunder and sort of speculated that the letter was just an attempt from 23andMe to discourage individuals from pursuing legal action. But we now know that tactic has failed miserably, as in September 2024, 23andMe agreed to settle a $30 million class action lawsuit to compensate some of the customers and provide them with free access to identity fraud protection and credit monitoring services.
That's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money, and at the time, Yvonne Eskenzi told us, victim blaming is a big no-no if you're trying to adhere to good PR principles, particularly in the cybersecurity sector, where so much of having a good security culture centers around being transparent.
Yeah. And while we do, obviously on the podcast and on the website, we deal with sort of the more technical side of things. When it comes to a cybersecurity response, as you said, as much as technical fixes to try and stop it are part of the response, some kind of crisis comms is also part of the response, being able to communicate effectively and without blasting a hole in your own foot to your customers, to your staff, what is going on, try and be reassuring, as transparent as possible. All those kinds of things go a long way to building goodwill, which I don't think that anybody could really accuse 23andMe of building goodwill following the breach that they suffered.
No, I think that's a great point. It kind of speaks to two aspects of crisis communications, where in the sort of rush and frenzy in the immediate aftermath of a cyber incident, having clear communication for those who are affected, who may have had their sensitive information leaked, is particularly important just for those individuals' peace of mind and also for their own personal OPSEC and information security, so they can take the appropriate steps to secure the rest of their digital portfolio, I suppose. But also, you need to engage in smart and transparent crisis communications, because your reputation down the line is going to be impacted by how you respond to this breach. And so it will have longer lasting impacts than just people being confused in the days after an attack. But you may lose some serious customer trust and investor confidence if you're shown to be frenetic and unable to keep a calm head when you've suffered a breach of some kind.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But Solomon, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
As always, you can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today, both spooky and otherwise, in the show notes, and even more on our website at ITPro.com.
You can also follow us on LinkedIn, as well as subscribe to our daily newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast wherever you find podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating or a review.
We'll be back next week with more from the world of IT. But until then, goodbye.
Goodbye. This episode is supported by NatWest, providing ease of mind when it comes to business payments.
NatWest Payit, the bank's own payment solution, facilitates customer payments in near real time while allowing companies to track live spending. Need to collect payments without customer account numbers or process refunds without holding on to personal details? Payit has your business covered.
Payit connects directly with each customer's bank account using an API, which also allows data to be seamlessly and securely passed onto third parties. That means you can provide the best payment experience on the front end while empowering your back-end staff with the info they need for truly data-driven decision-making.
To find out more, visit payitbynatwest.com/ITPro. That's PAYITBYNATWEST.com/ITPro.